My name is Eleanor, Ellie for short, though most people at the library just called me Ms. Vance, F, 40s, though feeling older lately. For 20 years, the Sterling City Public Library wasn't just my workplace. It was my sanctuary, my responsibility. I knew every creak in the old floorboards, the specific humidity level the rare books room needed, and which donors preferred handwritten thank you notes versus email updates. I loved the quiet hum of the place, the smell of old paper and binding glue, the feeling of connecting someone with exactly the piece of information they needed. It wasn't glamorous work, not like some people think. It was meticulous. Budgets, staffing, system upgrades, chasing down obscure interlibrary loans, managing preservation efforts. Just last month, I felt that familiar quiet satisfaction when I tracked down the original 1880s charter for the Old Mill District, a lost historical document crucial for a major city development project. It was hidden, misfiled under a defunct street name in the archives annex due to a cataloging error made probably 70 years ago. Nobody else would have found it. It took me 3 days of patient digging through records only I really understood, but finding it saved the city a lot of hassle and potentially millions in delays. That's the kind of quiet work I did. My boss, the library director, Cynthia, F50s, used to appreciate it. Or at least she didn't complain. Lately, though, maybe as she got closer to retirement, she seemed more concerned with appearances, image, being seen as innovative, even if the innovation didn't make much sense for a library. Which brings me to her niece, Haley, early F20s. Haley started as a part-time assistant maybe 6 months ago. Her main qualification seemed to be existing. That and a large online following based on, well, I wasn't entirely sure. Cynthia soon created a new title for her, Assistant Director of Community Engagement. Mostly, this involved running the library's TikTok account. I'd sometimes catch glimpses of her doing these strange, jerky dances between the stacks, often holding a book inappropriately as a prop. She talked constantly about vibes and how the Dewey Decimal System was vintage clutter that should be replaced by vibes-based shelving and grouping books by how they made you feel, apparently. I shuddered to think. And the selfies, constantly taking selfies with rare books, sometimes even using the flash, despite the signs. She treated our priceless collection like background props for her personal brand. I tried to gently explain the handling protocols once. Haley just waved a dismissive hand and said, "Lighten up, Ellie, it's just for a sec. Gotta get that content." Cynthia overheard and just gave me a tight little smile that said, "Don't make waves." Then came the meeting I didn't see coming. Just Cynthia, Haley, and someone from HR I barely recognized. Cynthia avoided eye contact, shuffling papers. "Ellie," she started, her voice artificially bright. "As you know, the library is moving in a new direction. We're looking to enhance our community profile, become more of a dynamic hub." I waited. "And," she continued, glancing at Haley, who was scrolling on her phone, "while your dedication over the years is appreciated, your traditional methods, well, they don't quite align with our new vision for a dynamic community hub." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Plus, we need someone who can champion fundraising through modern branding, which requires a different skill set." The HR person slid a folder across the table. "Termination agreement." My position was eliminated, effective immediately. Haley would be absorbing many of my duties as the newly promoted associate director. 20 years. Gone in 5 minutes, replaced by TikTok dances and vibes. The hurt was a physical ache in my chest, hot and sharp, but years of maintaining composure, of being the calm center of the library, kicked in. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, not then. I just looked Cynthia squarely in the eye for perhaps the first time that meeting. "I understand," I said, my voice level. I signed the papers, declined the offer to have security escort me, the indignity, packed the few personal items from my small office, a framed photo, a well-loved mug, a tiny succulent, and walked out of the Sterling City Public Library for what I thought was the last time. The silence in my car on the drive home was deafening. The first few days were a blur of shock, anger, and a surprising amount of just numbness. I updated my resume, filed for unemployment. Friends called, offering condolences like someone had died. In a way, someone had. The Ellie who believed loyalty and competence mattered more than buzzwords. I avoided looking at the library's social media, knowing it would just make me angry. But you can't avoid things forever. A week later, morbid curiosity won. And oh, it was bad. The library's normally quiet Facebook page was flooded with confused and angry comments. The first big public sign of Haley's reign was exactly what I'd feared. A disastrous TikTok trend attempt involving balancing books on heads had resulted in several damaged bindings, including a first edition poetry collection I'd painstakingly restored years ago. Someone had filmed it and posted it to a local community group with the caption, "Is this what my taxes pay for?" Then came the pictures of the nonfiction section. Haley had apparently decided the 800s literature needed more pizzazz and implemented her color aesthetic reorganization. Shakespeare was now shelved next to Stephen King because they both had black spines. History books were interspersed with cookbooks if their covers matched. It was utter chaos. Patrons were complaining they couldn't find anything. And the staff, bless them. I started seeing comments on local forums, anonymous at first, then bolder. Staff were openly complaining about the new chaotic management, mentioning confusing directives, impossible tasks, and a general sense of being ignored or belittled by Haley. Cynthia, they said, was either oblivious or just letting Haley run wild. Seeing the place I loved descend into chaos stirred something in me. The hurt was still there, but now it was mixed with a cold, simmering anger. They thought I was just quiet, negligible Ellie. They had no idea what 20 years of quiet observation and meticulous system building actually meant. My first moves were small, almost passive. Tests, really. Using the library's online portal from home, I anonymously submitted a complex research request. Something related to obscure city zoning laws from the 1920s, requiring access to microfiche records and archived council minutes I knew were a nightmare to navigate without the specific finding aids I had created, but never properly integrated into the main catalog, a project I never got funded. I knew Haley wouldn't have a clue where to even begin. Then I emailed Lauren, 30s F, a younger librarian I'd mentored who was still there, trying to keep her head down. I didn't ask her to do anything disloyal. I just casually mentioned thinking about the quarterly circulation reports. Remember that finicky subroutine you have to run to reconcile the ebook stats with the physical checkouts? Always tripped people up if they did step 4B before step 5A. Just a friendly reminder. Knowing Haley was now supposed to be overseeing those reports, I knew she'd likely bulldoze through, ignore Lauren's tentative warnings, and mess it up. Quietly informing my colleague about a specific, obscure procedure Haley was likely overlooking felt like pulling a single, almost invisible thread. The first real sign of panic reached me about a month after my termination. It was via email, a forwarded message from Lauren with the subject line, FW: urgent grant question, -help. The original email was from Cynthia to Lauren, sounding strained. It was about the Atherton grant. The big $1.5 million spread over 5 years, specifically for the acquisition, preservation, and digitization of the library's rare book collection. Old Mr. Atherton had been a notoriously meticulous philanthropist, and the grant reporting requirements were legendary in their complexity. Detailed progress reports, specific metrics on preservation conditions, itemized acquisition justifications, complex financial breakdowns. I'd handled it every year for the past decade. The next report was due in 6 weeks. Apparently, Cynthia had predictably handed it off to Haley. Lauren's forwarded email included a frantic message from Cynthia. Lauren, Haley's draft report needs work. Can you look it over? The foundation contact seems unhappy. We cannot lose this grant. Lauren added her own note to me. Ellie, it's a disaster. Haley just listed her TikTok view counts for the Rare Books unboxing series as community engagement metrics. The financials are nonsense. I think she offended Mrs. Dubois at the foundation. What do I do? This was it. The first real leverage. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to just write back, not my problem, but that wouldn't be as satisfying. I waited 2 days, letting their panic simmer. Then I replied to Lauren, thanks for the heads up, Lauren. Tell Cynthia I might be able to offer some guidance. Predictably, Cynthia emailed me directly within the hour. Stiff, formal, pretending this was just a routine query. Ellie, hope you're well. Lauren mentioned you might have some insights into the Atherton grant reporting idiosyncrasies. Would you mind terribly just jogging my memory on a few points? My turn, I replied promptly and professionally. Dear Cynthia, thank you for reaching out. Given the complexity of the Atherton grant and the specific historical knowledge required for accurate reporting, a simple jogging of memory wouldn't suffice. However, I am available for freelance consulting work. My rate for specialized grant consultation, particularly projects requiring deep institutional knowledge retrieval, is $500 per hour, payable upfront, with a 10-hour minimum retainer. The silence was immediate and profound. I could almost hear Cynthia sputtering through the screen. $5,000 just to start? For the work I used to do as part of my job? 2 days later, a much shorter, terser email from Cynthia arrived. Ellie, we appreciate the offer, but the library's current budget constraints prevent us from engaging external consultants at that rate for this task. However, any general guidance you could offer regarding the required data formatting from the archival database would be helpful. Perfect. She took the bait. Now I could be helpful. I spent an hour composing my reply. I provided technically correct information about accessing the raw data logs from the archival database system I had implemented years ago. The information was dense, filled with technical jargon, outdated command line arguments, and involved cross-referencing 3 separate, poorly integrated software systems. It was all accurate. It was also incredibly dense and difficult to understand without the cheat sheets and workflow diagrams I had created and kept in my office. The ones now likely buried in a box somewhere, if Haley hadn't already thrown them out as clutter. Following my instructions to the letter would take someone unfamiliar with the system weeks, not the days they had left. I hit send, a cold smile touching my lips. They lacked the expertise to implement it properly before the deadline. Checkmate for this round. The fallout from the Atherton grant wasn't immediate fireworks, more like a slow-motion implosion. Lauren discreetly let me know that Haley, after trying and failing to follow my helpful instructions, submitted something to the foundation. A patchwork report filled with fabricated numbers, desperate guesses likely, and plagiarized boilerplate language from online examples she probably found when searching for help. Apparently, Mrs. Dubois at the Atherton Foundation, a formidable woman I knew well, was not amused. Lauren heard Cynthia shouting on a phone call with her, something about unprofessionalism and breach of trust. The foundation didn't pull the plug immediately, but the grant was officially placed under review, funding frozen pending a full audit. It sent shockwaves through the library board. Cynthia survived the subsequent emergency board meeting barely. Rumor was one board member called for a vote of no confidence, but lacked support for now. But Cynthia was visibly shaken, her authority undermined. Now that they were wounded, it was time to apply more pressure, using the library itself as the weapon. My knowledge wasn't just about grants and systems, it was about the place, its history, its rules, its physical being. First, I saw a post on the library's Instagram, Haley's handiwork naturally, announcing a major spring refresh. Part of this involved clearing out the musty old local history pamphlets from the archive's reading room to make space for more charging stations and comfy chairs. I knew that collection. It wasn't just pamphlets. It contained fragile documents, letters, and photographs crucial to the town's history. More importantly, I remembered lobbying the State Archives Board years ago to get that specific collection designated under special protection laws due to its unique nature. I found the documentation on the State Archives website, public record but buried, highlighted the relevant statute, and sent an anonymous email to the president of the local historical society, CCing the State Archives compliance officer. Within days, a sharply worded cease and desist letter arrived at the library, citing state law and threatening legal action. Haley's refresh was dead in the water, and Cynthia had to issue a public apology, looking foolish. Revealing that the deaccessioning plan violated state archival laws felt like justice for the history they disdained. Next, I remembered the library's original land deed from the 1890s. I'd studied it years ago, when there was talk of expansion. There was an obscure clause, a covenant, stipulating that a specific, seemingly unused grassy plot at the back of the property must remain undeveloped green space for the quiet contemplation of the citizenry. Cynthia had recently been championing a proposal to lease that exact plot to a trendy coffee chain for a new drive-through kiosk, a modern branding revenue stream. Using a throwaway email address, I sent a copy of the relevant deed section, highlighted, to the city planning department and the local newspaper's investigative reporter. The coffee chain deal, which Cynthia had touted as her big success, collapsed under the weight of unbreakable historical restrictions. Revealing the land deed restrictions blocked the expansion project wasn't just about stopping a bad idea, it was about dismantling Cynthia's attempt to build a legacy on shaky ground. The atmosphere at the library, according to Lauren, and the online forums turned toxic. Staff were demoralized, patrons were angry, and the local paper started running articles asking, "What's gone wrong at the Sterling City Library?" Cynthia became defensive and withdrawn. Haley allegedly threw tantrums, blaming everyone but herself. The final blow for Phase 1 came from an unexpected but welcome direction. Mr. Charles, the library's single largest private donor after the Atherton Foundation, was a quiet, elderly man who valued competence above all else. He'd always dealt directly with me, Apparently, he tried to contact the library about renewing his annual $100,000 contribution and had been repeatedly given the runaround by Haley, who didn't recognize his name or importance. Finally, he reached Cynthia, who tried to smooth things over, but it was too late. A week later, a formal letter arrived from Mr. Charles's lawyer stating that due to concerns about the current leadership and strategic direction, he was withdrawing all future support. Coming so soon after the Atherton grant being frozen, this was catastrophic news, and it leaked almost immediately. Cynthia and Haley were now cornered, financially unstable, publicly criticized, internally chaotic, and facing donors losing faith. They were bleeding, and I suspected their desperation would make them even more dangerous and more vulnerable. My quiet work was done. The foundation was laid. Now it was time to bring the house down. The air around the Sterling City Public Library felt different after the Atherton grant was frozen and Mr. Charles pulled his funding. You could almost taste the desperation. Online, the local forums buzzed with speculation. Inside, Lauren told me, the atmosphere was thick with paranoia and blame. Cynthia, instead of taking responsibility, seemed to double down, demanding longer hours from the already stressed staff and pushing even harder on Haley's superficial engagement initiatives, as if more TikToks could somehow fix a multi-million-dollar budget hole. Haley, meanwhile, apparently veered between arrogant pronouncements about her vision and tearful meltdowns in her office, the one that used to be mine. They were scrambling, and desperate people make mistakes. My quiet campaign needed to escalate. It was time to move beyond exploiting their incompetence and start exposing their deliberate wrongdoing. My first break came once again thanks to Lauren. She was nervous, but also angry. She'd seen enough. Late one night, I received an encrypted email from her personal account. Attached were discreetly forwarded copies of internal emails she'd been saved over the past few months. They showed Cynthia explicitly telling Haley how to phrase reports to obscure certain issues, instructing staff not to minute certain discussions about budget shortfalls, and even drafting excuses for Haley to use when donors asked difficult questions. It wasn't just incompetence anymore, it was an active cover-up. Armed with this confirmation of Cynthia's methods, I started digging into something that had always felt slightly off. The library's special acquisition funds, sourced from various restricted donations over the years. These funds had strict usage guidelines. Cynthia had always handled them personally. Back when I worked there, I'd sometimes noticed odd discrepancies. Small amounts moved between funds that didn't quite seem right, but I'd attributed it to Cynthia's somewhat disorganized bookkeeping and hadn't pursued it, focusing on my own areas. Now, with focused suspicion and 20 years of knowledge about how those donations were structured, I spent hours painstakingly cross-referencing old budget reports I still had copies of. I'm a librarian, I keep records, with publicly available, but hard to interpret without context, city financial statements. It took weeks of late nights, fueled by coffee and cold anger, but I found it clear evidence of Cynthia misusing restricted donation funds for years. Small amounts siphoned off for vaguely described operational overheads or consulting fees that coincided suspiciously with her personal travel or office renovations. It wasn't huge embezzlement, perhaps, but it was a definite misuse of funds, a pattern of dishonesty. Now, I had proof of cover-ups and financial irregularities. It was time to target their reputations more directly. Haley first. Her whole persona was built on being young, trendy, and supposedly qualified for the role Cynthia had gifted her. I remembered her mentioning her master's degree from an online university I'd never heard of. A little digging into the university itself raised eyebrows. It seemed barely accredited. More digging, including some careful searching through archived versions of Haley's old LinkedIn profile, people forget the internet remembers, revealed inconsistencies in her graduation dates and listed coursework. I compiled the evidence, the questionable accreditation, the shifting timelines, and drafted an anonymous, meticulously sourced email. I sent it to the HR department head at the city, who technically oversaw library HR, the library board president, and leaked it to the reporter who had been covering the library's troubles. Proving Haley had likely lied or exaggerated her academic qualifications struck at the very core of her undeserved position. Simultaneously, I turned my attention to the upcoming library board election. One of Cynthia's staunchest allies on the board, a man who always rubber-stamped her decisions, was up for re-election. His challenger was a retired school principal named Mrs. Gable, running on a platform of fiscal responsibility and transparency. Using another anonymous email and prepaid debit cards for small donations, I began anonymously supporting Mrs. Gable's campaign. feeding her campaign manager carefully selected and publicly verifiable data points about the library's declining performance metrics under Cynthia, asking pointed questions she could raise at public forums, and highlighting the lack of oversight that allowed the current crisis. I wasn't just attacking the current leadership, I was helping build its replacement. The pressure was clearly getting to both Cynthia and Haley. Haley became noticeably subdued online, her bubbly TikToks replaced by generic library announcements. Cynthia started making errors in public meetings, appearing flustered and defensive. It was time to deliver the crueler blows, the ones aimed not just at their jobs, but at their carefully constructed facades. The justification. They hadn't just taken my job, they had systematically dismantled the institution I loved through arrogance, incompetence, and dishonesty. They had personally insulted my life's work. This was personal. First, Haley's finances. It wasn't hard to guess she was living beyond her means, given her constant new outfits and talk of expensive trips. A few discreet inquiries through acquaintances, small-town gossip networks can be useful, and some pointed online searching revealed rumors of maxed-out credit cards and bounced checks. I packaged this information not as confirmed fact, but as concerning rumors circulating within the community regarding the fiscal responsibility of library leadership, and included it in another anonymous tip to the board and the reporter. Highlighting Haley's massive personal debts and shopping addiction wasn't just malicious. It raised legitimate questions about her judgment and potential vulnerability to misusing library resources. Even if I didn't have direct proof of the latter, the implication was damaging. Next, Cynthia's history of appointing Haley. I remembered the search for the assistant director position Haley got. It had seemed like a sham even then. Digging back through old library personnel files I'd archived digitally, part of a disaster preparedness plan I'd initiated, I found the original applicant pool list and the scoring rubrics. Haley wasn't just unqualified. She was demonstrably less qualified than several other internal and external candidates Cynthia had dismissed with flimsy justifications. I compiled this into a timeline showing how Cynthia had seemingly steered the process from the start. Evidence Cynthia manipulated the hiring process specifically to appoint Haley proved the nepotism everyone suspected. Cynthia's own misuse of resources was next. The emails Lauren provided weren't just about cover-ups. Some showed Cynthia casually asking library assistants to handle her personal dry cleaning drop-offs, book her vacation flights using the library's corporate travel account, to be reimbursed later, of course, or manage her personal social calendar during work hours. It painted a picture of entitlement. Proof Cynthia used library resources chief staff to run personal errands added another layer of ethical breaches. Finally, Cynthia herself. Her confidence always seemed brittle. I remembered her mentioning her own library, science degree, came from a small college that closed down years ago. Getting those transcripts was impossible now, but cross-referencing her official bio with publicly available alumni records from other institutions, she claimed affiliations with revealed gaps, inconsistencies, a conference presentation listed where the conference didn't exist, a claimed publication in a journal that seemed to have no record of it. Nothing definitively fraudulent, perhaps, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Exposing inconsistencies or exaggerations in Cynthia's own academic credentials undermined her authority completely. Who was she to judge my traditional method when her own background seemed questionable? Each revelation was carefully leaked, anonymously, spaced out over a few weeks to the board, the city HR, Mrs. Gable's campaign, and the local reporter. The cumulative effect was devastating. Cynthia and Haley were reeling, clearly suspecting each other now too, according to Lauren. Their public appearances became rare. The library felt adrift. The climax had to be definitive. A clean break. The upcoming monthly library board meeting was the perfect venue. It was always open to the public, and after the recent scandals, attendance was higher than ever with local media present. Mrs. Gable, riding a wave of public support, fueled by the library's chaos, had won her election and would be attending her first meeting. The stage was set. I spent days preparing. I compiled everything: the grant reporting failure, the land deed violation, the archival law breach, the emails showing the cover-up, the evidence of misused funds, Haley's fraudulent credentials, the manipulated hiring process, Cynthia's personal use of resources, the questions about her own background. I organized it into a clear, logical presentation, complete with scanned documents, highlighted emails, and verifiable data points. I made copies. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Cynthia and Haley sat at the front table, looking pale and drawn. I took a seat quietly in the back row. When the public comment section opened, I walked calmly to the podium. There were audible gasps. Cynthia's eyes widened in shock. Haley looked like she might faint. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady, amplified slightly by the microphone. "My name is Eleanor Vance. For 20 years, I served this library as head librarian. I was terminated 5 months ago. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resort to accusations. I simply stated facts. I have become aware," I continued, "of certain operational and ethical concerns under the current leadership that I feel obligated, as a citizen and former steward of this institution, to bring to the board's attention." For the next 15 minutes, I laid it all out, methodically. Clearly, I presented the evidence point by point, referencing the document copies I had provided to the board members beforehand. The financial mismanagement, the cover-ups, the nepotism, the violations of policy and potentially law, the academic inconsistencies. With each point, I could see the color draining further from Cynthia's and Haley's faces. The room was dead silent except for the clicking of reporters' cameras. I presented my meticulously compiled evidence directly to the library board during the packed public meeting. When I finished, I simply said, "Thank you for your time," and walked back to my seat. The silence stretched for a moment, then erupted. Board members were whispering furiously. The reporter dashed out. Mrs. Gable looked grimly determined. The board president, looking shell-shocked, called for an immediate closed session. Cynthia and Haley were asked to leave the room. They stumbled out, avoiding everyone's eyes. They were finished. The fallout was swift. Cynthia and Haley were immediately placed on administrative leave. And within 2 weeks, following a rapid internal investigation that confirmed my findings, their employment was terminated. The details, especially the potential misuse of funds and academic misrepresentations, were splashed across the local news. The library was in crisis, leaderless and demoralized. The board, now with Mrs. Gable providing a strong voice for reform, needed stability, and fast. They approached me. Initially, I refused. The thought of returning to that building, even vindicated, felt exhausting. But seeing the state it was in, seeing the pleading faces of former colleagues like Lauren, I couldn't let it crumble completely. I reluctantly agreed to return temporarily as interim director, but with strict conditions, full authority to make necessary changes, the board's public backing, and a clear timeline for hiring a permanent replacement, even if that replacement might end up being me. As for Cynthia and Haley, the city decided against pressing criminal charges for the misused funds, perhaps wanting to avoid a longer scandal. But the professional consequences were absolute. Cynthia was forced into a humiliating early retirement with a drastically reduced pension, her reputation in tatters. With her inflated credentials exposed and her aunt no longer able to protect her, Haley struggled to find any professional work at all. Her influencer dreams evaporated, leaving her with mountains of debt and few prospects. They became cautionary tales whispered in library break rooms. Cleaning up the mess they left was harder than I imagined. Rebuilding trust with staff, donors, and the community took time. We had to implement new financial controls, rewrite policies, untangle Haley's chaotic shelving experiments, and restart the search for the Atherton grant funding, which Mrs. Dubois, impressed by the swift changes, eventually agreed to reinstate. After 6 months as interim director, the board offered me the permanent position. This time, there was no hesitation. I accepted. I returned to my library, not just as head librarian, but as director, welcomed back by staff who cheered when my appointment was announced. It wasn't the same Ellie who had been fired. 20 years of quiet dedication had been betrayed, forcing me to find a different kind of strength, a colder, more strategic fire. The library needed rebuilding, and I was ready. The silence was over. It was time to restore the order I knew. But this time, everyone knew my voice and the power behind it. That's all for this story. I'll be back with another one. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It motivates me to create more content like this.